Greetings and welcome back to a deep dive into Matthew. I'm Jim Kirby. I'm your host. How about that bump music, huh? Pretty flashy. We're experimenting with it. So we're trying to make our episodes better, our YouTube videos better. Anyway, on this episode, we're going to talk about chapter 2, verses 1 through 23. And in that, we're going to talk about Matthew's story of the Magi. The Magi's following the star, their interaction with Herod in Jerusalem, their interaction with the Holy Family in Bethlehem. We're also going to talk about Mary and Joseph and Jesus' flight into Egypt. And also, Matthew's going to tell us how Jesus ends up in Nazareth. Now, before we get going, let's remind ourselves that we are just dealing with Matthew's gospel, okay, ideally. And we're going to be talking about the other gospel, Luke especially. But we have to be able to make sure that we're not bringing Luke too much into Matthew. We're not making Matthew say things he's not saying that Luke is saying. For example, around Christmas time, we always have this tendency to put Luke and Matthew together and make one big Christmas story. There's nothing wrong with that. It's fine, of course it is. But we have to be careful that we don't make that story, Luke and Matthew together, the scripture, and then we don't understand when we read Matthew and Luke separately. Well, how come they're different? Well, they are. Okay? And so we have to be careful that we don't want to make Matthew's gospel Luke's gospel and vice versa. We'll talk more about that in a few seconds. So let's stick with Matthew's gospel, his words, okay? And let's not try to make him say something he's not saying. By the way, thanks for all the comments. Thanks for your emails, jkirby1@me.com, and also you can leave your comments below. So, Matthew's gospel, chapter 2, verses 1 through 23. As we start looking at chapter 2, we're going to realize that chapter 2, verses 1 through 23 is really divided up into 4 stories. The first story is the Magi and how they come to Jerusalem in search of the King of the Jews. We're also going to talk about Mary and Joseph, their interactions with the Magi, and then their flight into Egypt. We're going to talk about Herod's reaction to the Magi's information, their story, and he's going to be part or call for the Massacre of the Innocents. And then part 4 is we're going to hear about the Holy Family coming back to Nazareth. And so we're going to talk about those 4 things. One of the things we're going to notice right away is the similarities between the Moses story and the Jesus story. Matthew points this out all the time, sometimes indirectly, sometimes directly. There are these motifs of Moses' life and Jesus' life that seem to intersect. And Matthew's doing this intentionally to connect Jesus with the Old Testament, the prophets, and now Moses. And he's also trying to reach his Jewish audience, and these things are going to ring true in their ear, and they're going to see the similarities of Jesus and Moses. Here's a couple of them, for example. Let's notice the irregularities between Moses' birth and Jesus' birth. Of course, they're not exactly the same, but they both have these irregular qualities that are described in the Bible. Both have an adversarial relationship with a king. Moses, obviously, with Pharaoh, and Jesus, obviously, with Herod. And these are adversarial relationships that dominate many parts of Matthew's gospel and Exodus. And so another thing that they share is this mass killing of males, okay? For Moses and Exodus, it's the killing of all firstborn males. And for Jesus, the Holy Innocence, Herod ordering the killing of every male child in Bethlehem from 2 years old and younger. And so that's a similarity. They are both forced to leave their country because of this relationship with Pharaoh and Herod. It both involves Egypt, okay? The Holy Family goes to Egypt. Moses leaves Egypt, but then later he's called back by God into Egypt. And so that's a similarity. And so these are the things that compare Jesus and Moses. And Matthew does this masterfully, and he does it intentionally. And he's approaching his Jewish audience with these similarities so that they can see the connection between Jesus and the Old Testament and Jesus and Moses. Let's start with verse 1. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea. Now, compare that explanation of Jesus' birth compared to Luke. It's just one sentence in Matthew. And he has his reasons for doing that. Luke has his sources, Matthew has his sources, and he has his way he's going to tell the story. Bethlehem, of course, is the ancestral home of David. Actually, Bethlehem is only 5 miles south of Jerusalem. You could walk there. It's really interesting. It changes the story, actually, for me, to realize how close they were. And so when the Magi go from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, it's 5 miles. It's not that big a deal. When I was younger, I imagined this great distance. Anyway, verse 1 starts us off and talks about Jesus' birth, but in a very stark, simple way. Continuing on in verse 1, we're going to hear about Herod. Matthew tells us historically what the time frame is in the days of Herod. Herod died around the year 6 BC. Okay, so we can put a historical date to the time frame of Matthew's story here. Now, Herod is this figure that dominates all of Matthew's gospel. The first Herod we're going to deal with is Herod the Great. He was the one that was responsible for rebuilding the temple. He was responsible for all these enormous building projects, and they were awesome. If there was one thing good about Herod, it was he was an architect and he was a planner. We'll talk a little bit more about his architecture later, but he was also known to be crazy. He was crazy. And so Herod the Great is the king of the Jews. He was appointed by the Romans, okay, and he has this relationship with the Romans that he plays off the Jews. He plays off the Jews on the Romans. We'll get into that later. But he was the last member of the Hasmonean family, the Hasmonean dynasty, which started back with the Maccabees. And so Herod has this huge part of Israel's history. The father, Herod the Great, and then his crazy sons that follow after that. Believe me, crazy family. Anyway, Herod's family dominated the historical narrative of Israel for the entire 1st century BC and the entire century AD. As I mentioned, Herod was elected king of the Jews for Israel, for that area, that Roman province that Rome had control over. And he was elected king of the Jews in order to facilitate any kind of discussion or control of these crazy people in this area. He eventually was put in charge of Jerusalem in the year 37 BC, and so there's this chaos that's going on with the Roman occupation and the Jewish fighting back against it. Herod the Great was shrewd in dealing with that. In a lot of ways, he was a great politician because he played off the Jews onto Rome. He played off Rome onto the Jews. He had a great relationship with the leaders of Rome, and he used that to his advantage, probably too much of his advantage. Anyway, he died in the year 4 BC, and the kingdom was divided up into his crazy sons. And so if you think Herod the Great was bad, well, here comes a couple of more Herods. It's like the Wizard of Oz. Oh, the Wicked Witch is dead. Well, no, that was the Wicked Witch of the West. Here's the East, and she's even worse than the first. That's kind of like it is with Herod. As I mentioned before, Herod is a master architect, Herod the Great. There are buildings of his that are still standing today. You can go and see them. They're huge. Take, for example, the temple in Jerusalem. I didn't realize how big that temple was until I got there and saw for myself. It's huge. Herod had this brilliant way of constructing these huge buildings that were, not only were they grand in scale, they were grand in beauty and opulence. He built this whole city on the northwest coast of the Mediterranean for Caesar Augusta with streets and a palace. That's where Paul was held for a certain part of his life. He also built all these great palaces. One, for instance, a famous one was the top of Masada, this huge mountain that has all this history with the Israelites, and Herod went there and made himself a little palace there to get away from the city. It's about 10 miles away, I think. So Herod needed some time away. He built all these palaces all throughout the Holy Land, these brilliant amphitheaters, these little cities, these buildings. And so if there was anything good about Herod, man, he was a great architect. If you want to read an interesting biography, read Herod's. There's nothing boring about this guy. Everything he did was big. He had domestic problems that he dealt with. Most of them were caused by him himself. He was cruel, even to his own family. Anybody that threatened his power or his authority, he would kill him just like that. And so his unpredictability and cruelty is well known. And so the massacre of the innocents that Matthew describes, that would have surprised no one when we're describing Herod. We're still in verse 1 when Matthew says, behold. Now remember, when Matthew says behold, pay attention, because something big is going to happen. And the big thing that happens in verse 1, chapter 2, is the appearance of the Magi. Now, it's hard to describe these guys. We try, but it's hard to classify them. Perhaps they were priests from Persia. We just don't know for sure. But here, they're described as some sort of astrologers, but that's not the only thing they do. They are able to interpret the movement of the stars that correspond to big things that are happening in the world. Now, astrology would not be a surprise to Matthew's Jewish audience. They accepted that. They understood astrology in certain cases, how you predict big things. And in this case, the King of the Jews, you can interpret that by the movement of the stars. We're still in verse 1, and the Magi have a problem. They don't know where the King of the Jews was born. And so they go to Herod, who should know. But the problem is he's also the King of the Jews. More on that later. But we assume that the Magi are Gentiles and not anything to do with the Israel faith or people. So they say they're from the east, but we're not really sure what does that mean. Where from the east are they exactly? And they also add a little detail. We followed his star in the east. Okay, that's a great detail, but it doesn't tell us how they followed the star or what the star did. And so their problem is they don't know where Jesus is born, King of the Jews. Now, King Herod and the scribes and chief priests should know this, but they don't. And so that's the problem that we're setting up right now with the Magi. Moving on to verse 2, the Magi speak. Where's the King of the Jews? We are looking for him. And Herod could easily say, well, I'm right here. Well, that doesn't make sense to the Magi because they're talking about his birth. Okay? Obviously, the question, where's the King of the Jews, is not about him. It's about the birth of the new King of the Jews. Now, this is going to be a problem for Herod. He's going to see that as a threat. He's going to see it as a rival. And we all know Herod is uncontrollable and unpredictable, and that's not going to last. Interesting enough, the King of the Jews is what the title is attached to Jesus' cross when he's crucified, the King of the Jews. So this title is going to follow Jesus. It's going to be applied to him, and it's also going to be used against him in chapter 27. The Magi go on and say, we saw his star at its rising. Now, as I mentioned before, astrology would not be something that was uncommon in first century Palestine. Jewish people would have bought into that. They used astrology to predict big moments in the world or the birth of prominent, famous people. Now, in our day and age, we try to figure out what was this phenomenon that the kings were following. And so astrologically, we could ask the question, well, maybe this was the birth of a new star, possibility. Maybe it was a supernova. Maybe it was a comet. And so we have all these theories, and we try to look back historically through astronomy to try to pinpoint the time and date of Jesus' birth. Another possibility is a comet because of its rising. The alignment of Saturn and Jupiter, that's a possibility, makes it bigger and brighter and more substantial in the sky. The Magi tell us that it was rising, and so that describes more of a supernova than alignment of planets because it was moving. As we're going to see, if we haven't seen it already, Matthew makes great use of prophets and the Old Testament scripture. And so when he starts describing a star, a lot of scripture scholars will say, well, it has to do with Numbers chapter 24, verse 17. A star shall advance from Jacob, and a scepter shall rise from Israel. Now, it doesn't seem to correspond with what Matthew is talking about. It's probably more astrological that the Magi are following, and more of that than some echoing of something from the Old Testament. Now, when we get to verse 9, we're going to clarify the role of the star. It's going to move, and they're going to follow him, and it's going to rest over where Jesus is. So, the story acceptable to people during Jesus' time that the star was leading them to the birth of the King of the Jews? Absolutely. Sure, they would have bought that. That was something they would have believed in. Continuing on in verse 2, the Magi tell Herod that they've come to do him homage. Okay, they want to honor him. Homage is a Greek word. It's a word that means an act of submission, a bowing, a prostration before a person of great distinction and honor. Here they're going to do this before a king. This is the proper posture you would take in coming before someone of such great status. It's also the proper posture for humans as they stand before God. In verse 3, Matthew tells us that when Herod heard this, he was greatly troubled, and with him all Jerusalem. This is one of my favorite lines from Matthew's gospel because it's such hyperbole. Jerusalem, as it does in the Old Testament, takes on human qualities, anthropomorphic. And so Jerusalem has this quality, this human quality, that they're upset. Another example of this is during the Passion narrative, Matthew 27, verse 25. And the whole people said in reply, "His blood be upon us and upon our children." In both cases, it's describing that a lot of people, but obviously it's not every single person. Clearly, Mary and Joseph or the Magi didn't agree with that. But this is a way for Matthew to tell his readers that this is big and it's controversial and it's something that everybody's hearing, everybody has an opinion on. So when Herod hears this, now he's startled and stunned in verse 4. He gets together his guys, okay, the chief priest and the scribes. The chief priest probably obviously include the current chief priest, but also the past chief priests that were still around and their families. The scribes, we probably know that these guys are expert in interpreting the scripture. So they had all this knowledge, and so they had a lot of power because they were the ones that had the knowledge. But the knowledge they didn't have was where the King of the Jews was to be born. They had the information that the Magi didn't, okay? And so they supposedly can answer the question of the Magi regarding the King of the Jews. Now, Matthew is going to do a good job here because he's going to start introducing us to Jesus' enemies. The chief priest and scribes are going to play a big part of the Passion narrative and this adversarial group that Jesus faces throughout Matthew's gospel. So you'll notice in verse 4, they're trying to figure out where the Messiah was born. Okay? Now, Matthew interchanges King of the Jews with Messiah quite a bit. He does that on purpose, again, connecting with the genealogy and the prophets. Where's the Messiah? The Messiah is going to be a big deal for the Jewish people and Matthew's audience. And so Bethlehem would have been the accepted place where the Messiah was to be born. And so that's what the scribes and the chief priests are finding out. But notice how Matthew is going to use Messiah and King of the Jews interchangeably. When we come to verse 6, we're going to be confronted with the idea that Matthew just does not quote Scripture very accurately. He uses quotes that aren't really in the Old Testament. Now, there's versions of them, and there's chances that two Scripture passages being crammed together to make what Matthew is talking about, but it's difficult. Verse 6, "And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah, for out of you shall come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Now, manuscripts that have been found try to put Micah, that's Micah's quote, but it's more likely a combination of two scriptures, Micah and Samuel. Here's Micah chapter 5, verse 1. "And you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, least among the clans of Judah." Okay, that sounds like what Matthew's talking about. And here's Samuel. "And the Lord said to you, you shall shepherd my people Israel. You shall be ruler over Israel." Okay, and so it's going to drive us crazy that Matthew is so sloppy when he's quoting scripture, but it doesn't seem to bother him, and it didn't seem to bother his people. I think it's the attempt that Matthew is reaching back to the Old Testament in whatever form. And so here's an example. We've got to be okay with this, okay? And so these early manuscripts that try to apply Micah to it are doing exactly what we're trying not to do. We're not trying to make Matthew say things he's not saying. He's not saying it was Micah's quote. It could be a combination of his and Samuel's. Matthew uses this quote and he specifies Bethlehem of Judah. It's interesting that he does that because there's another Bethlehem up north near Nazareth, that Bethlehem of Galilee. Not that Bethlehem, but this Bethlehem in Judah. And so you'll notice that in the Old Testament they use the words Bethlehem and Ephrathah interchangeably in a lot of cases. There's some references to Ephrathah in the Old Testament, describing a woman, for example. Biblical locations, for example, this lady that we're talking about named Ephrathah is the wife of Caleb, son of Hezron, whose son Salma founded Bethlehem of Judah. Now, you can look that up. Look at Chronicles, and you'll see how these references are made. And so Matthew, again, reaching back to the Old Testament, the old prophets, and pulling some of these quotes forward. In verse 8, Herod tells the Magi, he's telling them to go to Bethlehem, and when you find him, come back and report to me so that I can go and worship him also. Herod's idea was they would go to Bethlehem and figure it out and find him and then come back and tell him, obviously because he's threatened by him and he's a rival, they would report directly to him. Herod is obviously insincere when he's talking about going to worship the new king of the Jews. He wants to find out where he is and kill him. So you have this contrast between the Magi's authentic desire to worship the new king of the Jews and Herod, who's a hypocrite. In verse 9, we're going to get a little bit more information of how the star is leading the Magi. And the star which they had seen in the east went on before them until it came and stood over the place where the child was. Okay? So the star's movement is identified and described a little bit more on how it was used for the Magi to find Jesus. It's unclear on how this star did it, because if you look up in the night sky and you see all the stars, how do you notice where they're over, what place they're over? So it's really hard, and Matthew is unclear on how this star gives this group of Magi information on where the King of the Jews is born. Now verse 11, we're going to come to one of those moments when it's going to challenge our traditional beliefs, okay? Now, let's set it aside, let's be okay with it, because in verse 11, it says, after coming into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother. Matthew assumes Mary and Joseph and Jesus are in a house, okay? There's no need to make the leap to cave or stable. Now, that's our traditional belief, but it's not what Matthew is saying, okay? And so Matthew explains how Mary, Joseph, and Jesus came from the house in Bethlehem to their home in Nazareth. If you notice in Luke, Luke describes how they get from Nazareth to Bethlehem, with Mary and Joseph's journey. So this is one of those things where, boy, we wish Matthew would say stable. We wish he would say cave, but he doesn't. Now, we're confusing Luke's gospel with Matthew's gospel, so we have to be okay. Set that aside. Don't put words in Matthew's mouth. In verse 11, Matthew tells us that the Magi present Jesus with 3 gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And by the way, let's notice, Matthew doesn't tell us how many Magi there are. Okay, he doesn't say it. Now, our legend, our tradition has come for us to believe that there were 3 gifts, 3 Magi. Is there anything wrong with that? Absolutely not. But it's not in Matthew's gospel. We're scripture scholars, so we have to not put words in Matthew's mouth. Now, we've even given these guys names, okay? Is there anything wrong with that? It's harmless, except when we try to make these legends or traditions biblical facts or historical facts. Here's some of the ways that we have used to describe who these Magi are. Psalm 72, verse 10, let the kings of Tarshish and of the islands bring presents. The kings of Sheba and Seba offer gifts. So that, we apply these ideas to our traditions. And so, they're kings, because it says it in Psalm 72. And so then also we can figure out where they come from, or we think we can. Isaiah chapter 60, verse 6 suggests that they were from Sheba, Arabia, or the Syrian desert. Here's what Isaiah says: the young camels of Midian and Ephah, all those from Sheba will come. They will bring gold and frankincense. So you see how legend and tradition, even back in the time of Matthew, have put these quotes together to make one quote that Matthew uses. And so they use all this imagery and all the words and descriptions of the Old Testament to apply to Jesus. They were already doing that, and they were comfortable doing it. It drives us crazy because we want accuracy. We want Matthew to be as accurate as possible. It just wasn't in his wheelhouse. And his audience was okay with it. They were fine with it. In verse 12, we're going to find out that Joseph isn't the only one who has dreams. The Magi have dreams. And remember, dreams are an accepted way of divine communication in first century Palestine and even today. So the Magi have dreams, but Matthew doesn't tell us that there was an angel speaking to them. Joseph is the only one that has an angel in his description of his dream. And so it's the same pattern that Matthew introduced in the first chapter, and also in verse 19, he's going to explain it again, these dreams that keep popping up. This is how God is going to communicate with the Magi and Joseph. In this dream, the Magi are going to be told Herod's real reason for their search. He wants to destroy the child. And so the Magi hear this in their dream. Now, again, here's the comparison of Moses and Jesus. Okay, Jesus with Herod, Moses with Pharaoh. Okay, to destroy these people. Okay, Pharaoh wants to destroy Moses, Herod destroyed Jesus. It's historically correct to describe Herod as vicious like this. There would be no doubt that he's capable of doing this. Ruthless and cruel to defend his power, no doubt about it. And so we're setting up this idea, this constant confrontation between Jesus and the authorities, the chief priests and the scribes and Herod. And so this is going to be something that's being applied to Jesus all throughout his life, this animosity that's going to keep driving the story of Matthew. So there's going to be another dream for Joseph, the one where the dream tells Joseph that Herod has died. And so Matthew right away adds another quote from the Old Testament. Basically, this quote, out of Egypt I've called my son, is close to Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. When Israel was a youth, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son, son of God. Okay? Matthew emphasizes this idea Jesus is the son of David and also the son of God. Okay? Echoes all kinds of Old Testament motifs. Jacob coming out of Egypt, Moses in Egypt, going in and out of Egypt. So this is something that's connected, familiar to the Jewish people and Matthew's audience. So again, without hitting us over the head, well, he is, he's emphasizing this connection between Jesus and the Old Testament, Jesus with the history of the Israel and their people. Here's one of the examples where the translation just does not fit the idea of the verse or the sentence. Verse 16 describes, then when Herod saw that he had been tricked. Tricked is just not a very strong word here. It's not strong enough. Deceived is a better word, but the use of this word that Matthew uses, it's more about being ridiculed, not just faked out or tricked or deceived, but to be ridiculed, to be cheated or lied to in a way that makes you look stupid, to be made a fool of. And so that makes more sense why Herod's reaction is such that he's going to go fly off into this rage. The same word, deceived, is going to be used about Jesus in Matthew 27, 29, and 31 during the Passion. So being tricked, deceived, to be made a fool of, it's stronger than just being tricked. In verse 16, we get the horrible description of the massacre of the innocents. And so this is Herod's solution to the problem of having another king of the Jews. And so his idea, kill all of them, all males 2 years and younger. So we're kind of getting information of the time span here. And so Herod is obviously trying to destroy the threat. And Jesus is the threat. Now this is, as we've mentioned, Herod's MO, to kill old or young with absolutely no thought to it. Wouldn't bother him in the least. Killing those 2 years and younger, male, certainly echoes Pharaoh's actions in Exodus chapter 1, verses 15 through 22. Let's take a moment to look at the timeline here. Herod dies in 4 BC. And so we can look at these things and come up with some clues on when this might have happened or when Jesus was born. Okay, so Herod dies in 4 BC. Now, because he orders the death of all male children 2 years and younger, gives us the idea that this is 2 years have gone by, perhaps, during the time of the Magi telling him this, and the time when he felt that he was deceived, or when he found out that he'd been duped. And so it's customary because of this to put Jesus' birth at between 6 and 7 BC. It assumes that Herod took all of the possibilities he could possibly to kill his rivals. And so this idea of 2 years and younger, if it's applying to Herod, you would think that it would be pretty accurate. So anyway, that's kind of how we take these clues from Luke's gospel and Matthew's gospel and apply them and try to come up with some sense of the historical setting for Jesus' birth and all of these stories that are taking place afterwards. Verse 18, Matthew's going to use a quote attributed to Jeremiah. Now it seems like Matthew looks at Jeremiah as kind of a model for Jesus, or kind of the role that Jesus is fulfilling from the Old Testament. So he's going to use the motif of Jeremiah and try to quote him, in other words, to make Jesus the example that is being formed by Jeremiah, but to be fulfilled in a big way. So you also hear the word Ramah, and we talk about Rachel. Now Ramah is halfway between Bethlehem and Jerusalem, and legend has it that that's where Ruth died, okay? But in this reference, she's described as weeping for her children, okay? And so tradition tries to assimilate this idea that Rachel's suffering is predicting the suffering of the Holy Innocence, okay? So again, more connections with the Old Testament, more connections with the genealogy. In verse 20, the angel is back. And Matthew says, behold, important thing coming up here, the angel tells Joseph that the people who are trying to kill him have died, okay? The angel uses the plural those, which suggests that the scribes and chief priests, or maybe like before, all of Jerusalem, all the people that were responsible for this violence and this seeking him out are all dead. So again, it's preparing us for the introduction of these enemies that Jesus is going to face throughout this gospel. Again, this is going to echo the idea of being calling out of somewhere, especially the Moses experience in Exodus chapter 4, verses 19. And finally, in verse 23, we hear that Joseph, Mary, and Joseph land in this town of Nazareth. Now, Nazareth was a farming and agricultural community. It was important because it was on the Via Maris. And why is that important? Well, it's a modern name. Via Maris is a trading route that linked Egypt with everything north, all the empires of Palestine, Israel, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and Syria, those areas. So a lot of traffic. And so that makes Nazareth a pretty important place where all this information and all this trade is taking place. Nazareth as a town is not mentioned in the Old Testament, but John's gospel has one of my all-time favorite gospel passages. Philip is looking at Jesus when they're trying to explain that here's Jesus and he's going to do all these great things. And Philip says, can any good thing come out of Nazareth? Excellent. It's one of those ways of speaking that just is dripping with sarcasm, and that's why I like it so much. In verse 23, Matthew gives us a reason why, at least biblically speaking, why the Holy Family ended up in Nazareth. He's given us a reason that was predicted by the prophets in the Old Testament. He shall be called a Nazarene. The problem with that is there isn't a quote in the Old Testament that says he was a Nazarene. It just doesn't fit. There's no quote that says that. And so you ask yourself, okay, where does Matthew get this? We don't really know, but it could be from the word Nazar, which is a name meaning one dedicated to God. And if you look in Judges, you can see an example of this. Chapter 13, verse 7, for the boy shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb. Okay, so that's a possibility of where this is coming from. Nesser is another way of looking at this and connecting it with Jesus and the Old Testament. Nesser can be translated into branch, okay? And so we naturally associate this with Isaiah chapter 11, verse 1, and a branch from his roots will bear fruit. This is all over in Advent, the readings that we use. Okay, and so this is a way of connecting Jesus with the Old Testament and trying to square Matthew's use of this prophecy and the town of Nazareth. So there you have it, chapter 2, verses 1 through 23. We've got the Holy Family now settled in Nazareth. You know, I would love to do just a whole program just on Herod. It's just fascinating. And, you know, the idea of Masada, the temple, it's just fascinating how Herod was able to do this and how crazy he was and how ridiculous his sons were. By the way, Archelaus was so bad at running Jerusalem that's where the Romans decided that they were going to appoint governors, hence Pontius Pilate. So there's another reason, okay? And that's a historical thing, by the way, Pontius Pilate. I wish I could do a whole thing on just Josephus. Josephus was a historian during the time of Jesus that provides us with a lot of information, and a lot of information that corroborates the Gospels, okay? And that's another, and he's not the only one. There are other historians that aren't sympathetic to Christianity or anything, but they record these events, and a lot of it corroborates the Gospels. Okay, so that's our episode for today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have questions, email me, jkirby1@me.com. Also leave your comments below. And what about that bump music? Do you like it? Just tell me. I'd love to hear it. Anyway, I'm Jim Kirby, I'm your host. We'll see you next time on A Deep Dive into Matthew.